Welcome to the second episode of the Why Intercept podcast. I am standing up while I'm doing this one because, fun fact, I have restless legs, and although I don't think that will change anything for the audio, if it does, please let me know because hopefully it's better, and if so, I'll keep doing it. The topic for this week is my thinly veiled attempt to talk about identity. Yes, we're asking all these questions about this label of being a fashion designer, but what we're really getting to the root of, the big why as to why does any of this matter, is because I have learned that certain titles can really subtly influence the way that we show up in our lives, in our purpose, and it's something I've really never had to think about prior. Because this comes with such a personal story, I hope that there's something meaningful in this for each of you. So with that being said, I am your host. My name is Simi Kathari, and I have a degree in cognitive science with a concentration in neuroscience from the University of California, Berkeley. I also have worked at Google, I've worked at Stripe, and I ultimately don't really think that those are reasons that you should listen to me. I think that you should make up your mind for yourself. So with that, welcome to the Why Intercept, and we jump in. I am in the world of fashion, and sometimes my clothes sell. That places me squarely into the role of being a fashion designer, which is what I thought I'd always wanted. And yet, the first time that I was consistently called an incredible fashion designer, which was with the most love and kindness and support anyone could ever have wanted, I felt off. I felt off about it, and I didn't quite know why. And so, naturally, it made me want to understand fashion. What is fashion? As defined by Merriam-Webster, fashion is a term that applies to any way of dressing, behaving, writing, or performing that is favored at any one time or place. Favored being the operative word, because it indicates there's an in-group and an out-group, which is something that I don't think is really lost on us with the concept of fashion. There are things that are fashionable and things that aren't. And this in-group and out-group isn't also always a bad thing, because when we think about style, a lot of people build really eclectic style by purposefully being anti-fashion. I will explore that in a different episode, all about style, but for the sake of what this idea of fashion is, we'll take it one step further. There's a stylist named Dan Trepanier whose blog I stumbled across. He's this hilarious dad who is both simultaneously a stylist, but also has a problem with the world of fashion. And his basis for this is that not only is fashion predicated on selling us things, but that it artificially creates demand for things by speeding up the pace at which trends change, which is called the fashion cycle. And for all of us who are exposed to fast fashion, that's essentially what it is. They just create new styles so frequently that you feel like you're going to miss out if you don't buy them, and they do that on purpose. It's a psychological way of manipulating our sense of urgency. Not only is it centered on the buying of goods, it's been greatly publicized as being one particularly that preys on people's insecurities with their body and their appearance, and maybe that's where this uncomfortableness comes from. And we're not the only people to feel this way. I came to find that Plato in 400 BC was attributed with writing the following: clothes are linked with beauty. However, they are linked with beauty in the context of a fraud that is perpetrated on those seeking the beautiful. That's fucking savage, Plato. But it's a concept that's existed for a very long time. And then you take into account the social and environmental implications of fast fashion, and whoom, all of a sudden, fashion just feels like this potentially terrible thing, and maybe we don't want to be a part of it. Here's the thing, fashion isn't all bad. If it was unilaterally bad, we wouldn't buy into it. First of all, fashion is very much not the only industry that's predicated on people making a product to sell us things. That's every industry, insofar as that's the medical industry now in some extent. Yes, fashion has created a lot of division in society between race and gender and class, etc. But because there's consumerism in an industry like fashion, that it's become an opportunity for designers of today to create really cool, innovative things, to remove those boundaries. And I have met incredible designers that are doing just that. They're creating lines that are intentionally gender neutral, that allows for more fluidity. I saw a proposal for technology that can aid with disabilities, one in particular being garments that are outfitted with sensors so that they can help the wearer identify certain sensory inputs, which is so cool. And I just met a gentleman recently who showed me they're making this silk-like material in India out of orange peels. Orange peels, you guys. When I tell you it literally resembled silk, I was baffled. Like, I don't know how. But this is what I mean. There's designers that I have met that are championing textiles and designs from their culture. There's a lot of really well-intentioned things happening in this world of fashion. And again, it's because of this commerce aspect that people are motivated to explore these potential solutions to where they see an opportunity to provide their values and their expression to society. And this is where we come to realize that maybe the problem with the term fashion designer is not in the word fashion. Maybe it's not the industry. Maybe it's the process. I started thinking about something that a group of designers told me when I was asking them about these nuances. And they said, Sumita, no offense, but we regard you as an artist. This is the meat and potatoes of the entire episode. It gave me a foothold on which to investigate. And my goodness, you guys, I cannot overemphasize the amount of controversy that exists in this dialogue between fashion and art and whether the two coexist. Here's the thing. In my head, of course they can. Of course fashion can be art and art can be fashion. But wow, is there a lot of debate on this? I had no idea. And there's a lot of reasons, and I'll share them with you guys. There's studies that have been done to investigate this. And I'm so excited to jump into it. But I really clearly want to specify this isn't an exploration of how fashion over time becomes historical and therefore becomes an artifact which ends up in a museum and has artistic value through that quality. That is an entirely different type of artistic identification, but for the idea of if fashion is art and art is fashion, we're exploring it in the context of present day. Are people who create clothes artists and or are artists designers? And if so, why don't we call them fashion artists? Why do we call them fashion designers? Welcome. We finally got into it. Deep breaths, clasp your hands, clench your butt cheeks. We're diving in. Fashion and art. I totally thought that of course fashion is art. What's my reason? I don't know. Sometimes I make things with tape and scissors. And yes, a glue stick has been known to get involved. So kind of feels like an art project. But there is a really incredible study that was done by two researchers that go by the surnames Padroni and Volante. And they investigated this exact topic as to whether fashion design could be considered art or whether that was pushing it. And they did this by conducting 21 interviews over 20 years. Specifically with fashion designers that were based in Milan. And why Milan, you might ask? For two very intentional reasons. One, they noted that it is the Italian hub of fashion-related activities, and two, because it belongs to this tiny cohort of cities, including Paris, London, New York, and Tokyo, that are the so-called fashion capitals of the world, and the places that I believe and understand to have fashion weeks. They interviewed these designers, and these designers were between the ages of 24 to 71. And the interviews were so interesting to read, by the way, that I highly suggest you go read the study. I will link it in the show notes. Guys, what they conclusively found blew my mind. And I'm just going to read for you the conclusion because, oh my gosh, I couldn't believe it. They found that identification with art is often rejected by fashion designers because designers seek to legitimate their cultural production not through art, but through a culture of wearability. Basically, what this says is the designers didn't believe that they were artists because they believed that they had an entirely different pursuit of meaningfully shaping culture through what we wear. And I think that one interview answer particularly highlighted this in a really clear way because the researchers actually analyzed that designer's answer, and this is what they said about it. They said that the designer compares themselves more to a psychologist of dress. They consider that there's so much psychosociological effort that goes into understanding consumers, from the manufacturing element to the merchandising. So through this process, they therefore consider themselves more as a cultural mediator and the producer of tools for communication and social interaction, which, to be fair, if I see someone wearing something super cute, I'm going to go say something to them. And that social interaction was facilitated by the fact that the designer made something really damn cute. So I hear you. That makes sense. Having said that, I still don't understand why we separate them. And to this effect, we can look at the fact that there are so many designers who have self-identified themselves as artists. There's allegedly the father of haute couture. I don't really know how to say that word, but his name is Charles Frederick Worth, and he was so loud and proud about considering himself to be an artist. And similarly, there's another famous designer named Fortuny. These are designers that I don't know, and I really feel like I should, but I'm reading a lot about them in this book called Skirts, and I'll also link it in the show notes. It's very good. But anyway, I digress. This designer, Mariano Fortuny, was well regarded as an artist. Also, as a scientist, he casually had more than 20 patents for all the technologies he created with dyeing and weaving. So cool. And then there was a designer named Vionette, and she was considered to be an artist in fabric because she created the bias cut. That's a sewing technique that I still don't fully understand. Totally showing my stripes there. It's fine. But she was dubbed to be an artist in fabric by a fashion editor. And finally, there's someone named Madame Gris. She had always wanted to be a sculptor as a child. Insofar, she'd call her designs living sculptures. And she's quoted saying that for her, working with cloth or stone was pretty much the same thing. And truthfully, to share my bias, as someone who upcycles, that's kind of how I feel. But I did some research as to what it means to be in the world of art. And what I found is there's somewhere between 6 and 10 classically denoted art forms. It differs based off of who you ask, But even the Britannica, which cited that there were 10 classic art forms, didn't list fashion as one of them. And if you're thinking, oh yeah, it's probably because they're just really particular and nuanced, let me read off for you the ones that were mentioned. Architecture, calligraphy, dance, drawing, literature, motion picture, music, painting, photography, printmaking, sculpture, and theater. In all of those regards, it makes absolutely no sense to me as to why fashion isn't a component of them. I don't know why there is gatekeeping between fashion and art. I'm really excited to try and figure it out. But the reason it doesn't make sense to me is because so many of these disciplines are centered around similar things that we heard from the fashion designer, which is an attempt to shape culture in some meaningful way. And that is quite literally what we see happening back in the old days with impactful theater, and now additionally with impactful film. And when we think about fashion as a form of expression that's centered around commerce, those are elements that are not escaped by literature or architecture. So I don't understand why there's this resistance for fashion and art to be inclusive of each other. But if I had one guess, it would have to do with this school of thought on the difference between art and design. And you so don't have to believe me on this because I hardly believed it myself, but oh my gosh, there's a very clear boundary that has been drawn to distinguish these two. And I had no concept of this prior to doing the research for this episode. But I'm going to explain and share a couple elements. At a high level, what I have gleaned is that the function behind design is to sell and the function behind art is to create. And here's a couple facets in which that plays out. I will be quoting professionals that I found on the internet, and I will link all of it. Okay, art versus design. Art does not need to be practical, whereas design does. Art is not confined by practical restrictions, whereas design is required to create under certain guidelines that may or may not have artistic components. An artist makes art either for themselves or for others, but they don't have to make their message immediately understood by outsiders. Design has specific goals to be understood by its audience. Artists aim to create something that expresses their visions, ideas, and feelings. Design strives to create solutions for people, systems, or physical items, and users are always central to the design process. Guys, those are totally different things. Even though the end result might be the same, you might have a beautiful chair that was created either by an artist or designer. The way that they came about creating that chair stemmed from entirely different motivations and through entirely different processes. And this, finally, is the entire point of this whole episode, and you've waited so long to get here. But this is the purpose of intentionally investigating what it means to identify as a fashion designer. Because when I think back to some of the most surprised reactions I've gotten from people in this community, it's when I express to them that I've never had a strategic intention for the brand that I'm attempting to build. No grand aesthetic or cultural trend I want to impart on future generations. I've never had any of that. And it's because I haven't come to this world through a design-centered approach. I am so inspired by the designers that I've met who have all of these ideas, who have all of these visions, because they have come into this industry with a certain set of assumptions and a plan and a process for execution. And that is what makes us different, because when you're serving the end user, the end customer, and that influences how you create your piece of clothing, then of course it gets created in this entirely different way than if you were to create this piece of clothing just because it was simply an expression of your own experimentation and the ideas in your head, whether or not anyone else was going to accept it. And now I get to this personal story as to why this matters to me so much, why it matters to me to know that maybe I'm not a designer, maybe I come about this in a totally different way. And so I will start from the beginning. I met a gentleman at a lecture on fashion, and we will call him by the name of Victor. He caught the eye of many because there was something particularly delightful about his designs that he was wearing. And it wasn't just his green velvet jacket that was embroidered with birds and had really cool leather detailing. He had this bag, like a briefcase almost, and it had a leather top and a leather base and a leather strap that was strung over his shoulder. But the body of this bag was entirely transparent, and in it were growing live plants. And it was so cool. It was one of those whimsical things where you look at the person and you think, how did your mind come up with this? And I just want to say every single person that I met at this lecture was unabashedly invested in this idea of fashion and design, and they all had unbelievable talent. So in this regard, he was not the exception. But even though he wasn't a panelist or a lecturer, he was attracting a lot of attention. And so I'm not ashamed to admit that I waited my turn so I could go introduce myself. And we swapped information, he being not much older than I, but very successful already in this business. He'd been been making things for really big names like Kalani. He was mentored by Virgil Abloh at one point and had seen a lot of success in this industry. So I go about my merry way, and a few days later, he sees that I posted a picture of one of the things that I created in front of a backdrop that I made. It was a blanket that I'd hung from the ceilings with thumbtacks because in my eyes, I am trying to be more professional about my content. And yet, he responded to that photo and he said, "Hey, do you want a professional photo shoot backdrop?" And he sent me a picture of what he had. And I was blown away. Immediately, no, absolutely not. This is way too generous. And those things are expensive. But I will say, I'm working on trying to be better about receiving generosity. So I told him everything that was in my head. I said, this is way too nice. And yet at the same time, truthfully, I could use this. So how much would you be willing to sell it for? And he responded, which is such a glimpse into the kind of person that he is, "I'm not willing to sell it. I would just like to give it to you because I want to give it to someone who I know will use it." And so a couple days later, I jump in my car and I go drive over there to collect it. And I ask him, "Why are you getting rid of this?" And he says, "I'm done." To which I go, "Oh, for sure. You're just done shooting your content here. Maybe you've got a studio." "Okay, I get it." And he goes, "No, I'm done. I'm done making clothes." This was the moment. This is where I felt Mama Bear well up inside of me. I don't even know this guy, but I saw his talent, his creativity, his success, his ambition meant that there was no reality in which this should ever happen. And as I sat down and talked to him and heard his stories, I came to learn about all of the ways in which he has suffered through this process of creation. You see, he too is an upcycle designer, although so much better than me. And he started by creating things that fundamentally aligned with the way he saw the world and the message that he wanted to put out there. And it got him a lot of notable attention. But somewhere down the road, times changed and trends changed, and people moved on with what they were interested in. And so he changed what he made, and he started incorporating luxury brands into his creations because people were really gravitating towards those luxury elements. And when he didn't sell them, he felt bad, and when he did sell them, he still felt bad because it wasn't what he aligned with. And that's the difference. That's the difference between artist and designer, because designer wants to create ultimately the thing that will sell to their target audience. But an artist wants to create. And so down this road he went. He created jerseys for a bunch of kids for charity, and because they got a lot of positive attention, someone somewhere ripped them off and started selling his designs for their own profit. He put his clothes in his friends' stores, and even when they'd sell, he wouldn't get commission. And I hated this, and despite my best efforts to turn it all around, I couldn't. A week later, he communicated to his community that he was giving away all the pieces he created for free. And I called him, and I said, "What's going on? Do you want me to just store these for you, or do you want me to try to sell them? Is there a lot of emotionality attached to the commercialization of this?" To which he said, "No, I don't want any of that. I just want to be done with this." And a few days later, he called me and he said, "Look, everything is gone except a bag of things that I saved for you, and I'd really like for you to have them." And so, for the second time, I went over there to go collect this bag, and it took me several days to open it. What I found was something that would have only been given from one artist to another artist. In that bag was a piece of bark that resembled a corset, and in it he had seen potential that he knew I would also appreciate. There were pieces of a broken ceramic plate with this gorgeous pattern on it that, again, I knew he would sense my excitement at trying to figure out how to make something from it. And beyond that, there was so many gorgeous zippers and buttons and thread in every color, trimmings and lace and ribbon, and random leather straps and objects, things that make no sense to anyone who has a purported target audience. But they made sense to me as an artist. And so it's given me a lot to think about, because I can understand how you enter into this industry and all of a sudden you're a fashion designer, but it might come at the price of sacrificing being an artist and a scientist and an engineer and an inventor. And that might be worth protecting more than this ideal, even if it feels like there's success in it. And if your why is something that you're sacrificing along the way, because your why is 1 or 2 steps removed from the actual thing that you are doing on a day-to-day basis, it just might be worth investigating and pinpointing so you don't lose it. And so on that note, I hope that there's something meaningful in this for each of you. If you have any other thoughts on this episode, I would love to hear from you. You can reach out to me on Instagram at by.zoom or at the Y-intercept. I totally forgot I'd created an Instagram for this podcast. So either of those, or you can reach out to me on my website, which is byzoom.com. I'm also on YouTube. I'm also on TikTok. And with that, I hope that you enjoy living life through the lens of whatever identity you have currently adopted, and I will catch you next time.